Hello, okay. Now we are in chapter 8, which is actually the introduction to statistical inference. Remember, we talked about descriptive statistics, which deals with graphical methods and summary statistics. So actually, those were the two types of things that we covered in exam one. Okay, and then um, during after exam one, chapter 6 and 7, we talked about two specific distributions like binomial and the normal distributions. Binomial was a discrete probability distribution, and normal was for continuous, distribution. Um, Now, actually, you can think of those two chapters to be like foundational chapters for statistical inference. Okay. Now, this is statistical inference is the other branch of statistics. So it's like descriptive statistics and statistical inference. Those are like the two branches of statistics that we are we are concentrating in this course. Okay. All right. So let's get started now. So in this chapter in your textbook, 8.1 covers concepts, 8.2 sampling behavior of a mean meaning sample mean, okay, like x bar, and then sampling behavior of a count and a proportion. Count is to deal with number of successors in a binomial situation, okay, and then along with the count comes the proportion. Like if you if you have let's say three heads out of 10 tosses, proportion of heads would be 3/10. Okay, so count and proportion are pretty much equivalent. It's just that in order to get the proportion from a count, you need to divide the count by n, but they are pretty much equivalent, or if you know one of them, you know the other. Okay, all right, so let's go to the next slide. Mm, okay, so this is the slide where we begin concepts. Now this these few slides I'm going to go really slowly because these are new concepts. So I think I need to pause a little bit so that you can think of what I'm talking here, and then what you are reading. Okay, so first of all, statistical inference is the act of generalizing from a sample to a population with calculated degree of certainty. Okay, now we have talked about population and sample before. Population is the entire collection of the measurements of interest, right? If you want to get the average GPA, the population will be the GPAs. Okay, the sample will be a sub collection of the population. So in other words, if the interest is in calculating the average GPA for Penn State freshmen, you can take a sample of 1,000 Penn State freshmen, and then collect their GPAs. So the sample will have 1,000 GPAs. Population will have a whole lot. All the Penn State freshmen's GPAs will go into the population. Okay, so population is this really large thing. Sometimes it may be it's so large enough we cannot even visualize, and then sample is a small sub collection of the population. Okay, now typically we are curious about parameters in the population. Parameters are numerical values that describe the population. Okay, and then typically they are unknown. Okay, so you can think in terms of the mean of a population. If you think about Penn State freshmen, what is the average GPA of all the Penn State freshmen? That's a huge population, right? But see, that value is not known. The actual GPA, actual average GPA of all Penn State freshmen is very difficult to find out because we cannot access each Penn State freshman. Okay, so now such quantities which are associated with the population are called parameters. And remember, moment you see the word parameters, unknown should should strike you. Okay, in other words, parameters means unknown. So if these parameters, which are very important to us, which we are very curious about, are unknown, so what do? We try to estimate them by making use of a small sample. So now we take a small sample. The sample will have data. Think in terms of GPS. Now, out of this data, we can create statistics. Statistics is any quantity that you can get out of the data. You can, just the sample mean is a statistic. It is some quantity. The sample median. If you take a sample, the smallest value, the fifth smallest value, you can even create meaningless statistics. Okay, so you have lots of these statistics. Important thing to remember about statistics is that they are computable, which means they are known, because they are all based on data that we know. A sample means, some sample we have with us. Okay, so that the reason why I have statistics is in green is because I just thought of traffic lights. Green means go, something good sign. So statistics means we know, and parameters we do not know, and that is why I have red for parameters. Okay, all right. So now since this idea is very important, I'm going to sort of go line by line here under these notes, and then let's sort of go over this together. Okay, all right. So statistical inference is the logical process by which we make sense of numbers. Statistics is pretty much about numbers, right? It is how we generalize from the particular to the general. See, a sample is a particular group of people. I mean, of course, we will try our best to represent. We'll try our best to choose the sample observations so that the sample will represent the population in a fair way. But nevertheless, it is a particular quantity, not the whole thing, not the general. Okay, but we have to generalize from the particular to the general. Now, this is an important scientific activity because, see, in this world, we always have to deal with such large things. We cannot access everything. So, we have to almost all the time estimate. So, this idea is very important and it should be done scientifically. So, this is an important scientific activity. So, because we do it scientifically only, we have to be concerned about this degree of certainty. Just because we estimate something with a sample and if you just report it, that's not the best practice. We need to give some assurance to the reader or the user that whatever you are calculating based on this sample, has high amount of confidence. Okay, so that is what is meant by degree of certainty. Okay, all right, so let's go back in here to the notes. Now consider a study that wants to learn about the prevalence of asthma in a population. We will draw a random sample from the population and find that 3 out of the 100 individuals in the sample have asthma. So the prevalence in the sample is 3%, right? Prevalence we studied before, how to calculate is number of affected out of all. So 3 out of 100 will be 3%. However, we are still uncertain about the prevalence of the asthma in the population. Do you guys agree? Yes. See, this 3%, we got from this sample. Does it mean that the prevalence in the entire population is 3%? No. Maybe somewhere close if the sample is a good representation of the population, but you cannot ever expect this to be exactly 3% in the population. Because, see, the next sample from the same population may have fewer or more cases, right? So it could be 4% with another sample or 1% in the third sample. How do we deal with this element of chance introduced by sampling? So there is an element of chance because based on the sample you choose, these numbers, these estimates will vary. So how do we deal with this? If you have 10 samples, we will have 10 prevalence estimates. I mean, doesn't make sense. We need to some or other unify this, right? Okay. A similar problem occurs when we do an experiment. Each time we do an experiment, we expect different results due to chance. How do we deal with this chance variability? Even in a lab experiment where we think that measuring is so pure, still we will not get the same answer if you repeat the same experiment over and over. Okay, that we know. Okay, so how that means there is always chance in whenever we make measurements. We need to see how we deal with this. Okay. Our first task is to distinguish between parameters and statistics. Okay, so parameters are unknown, that's important. They are the characteristics that describe the entire population. Okay, see, parameters are the population value and are unknown. Statistics are from the sample and can be computed. So that's the major difference. Parameters are unknown, but they are very important to us. We are very curious about parameters because we are interested in the entire population. We are not interested in just one sample. In fact, from one sample to the other, the statistic value will vary, right? Okay. So, but the nice thing about the sample statistic is that, it is computable. Okay, so if you get a good enough sample which is representing the population in a very reasonable manner, whatever statistic that we get, we could be happy with. Okay, all right. Now the statistics will vary from sample to sample. Just think a little bit. 3% prevalence from one sample, 4% from another sample, 1% from the third sample. So the values will vary from sample to sample. They are random variables. So the statistics that you get from samples are random variables because they vary, even the prevalence. In contrast, the parameters are invariable. They are constants. The actual population prevalence is a constant, which we do not know, but they do not vary, okay? To help draw this distinction, we use different symbols for parameters and statistics. For example, we use mu to represent the population mean, which is a parameter, and x bar to represent the sample mean, which is a statistic. Okay. Now, typically, lots of times or most of the time, population parameters are denoted by Greek letters. Mu is a Greek letter. Just like that, the population standard deviation is denoted as sigma, another Greek letter. Now the sample counterpart is for the mean, it is sample mean, that would be x bar. X on top, you have that horizontal line, okay? And then likewise, the sample standard deviation is denoted by the lowercase English letter s, okay? Now give another example of a parameter and its corresponding sample statistic. Parameter could be sample standard deviation sigma, and the sample statistic will be the sample standard deviation, which is S. Okay, so now why don't you write down this example yourself in your notes? Okay, all right, while I give you half a minute to do that. Okay. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So now, in fact, in this slide, another recording to complete the remainder of the chapter. Okay, all right.